I'm not one of these people who thinks everything's a bubble. I actually do believe in this, but here's why. NVIDIA in particular, and I think a lot of people maybe got the wrong takeaway, which is that, I'm bearish on AI in general. I'm a big believer in AI. No, I'm really saying something different. You can still be bullish on AI and not think that necessarily NVIDIA's got it in the bag, that they can just continue to just compound at these kind of margins.
The thing that never made sense to me long term is it just feels like those 70, 80, 90% margins long term. I don't care what industry you're in, especially in a nascent one with very low competition with what you're doing today. It just feels impossible, especially with the amount of demand.
We're in this hockey stick moment for artificial intelligence, and the Cambrian explosion of possibilities is huge.
Even if you still believe in the hockey stick growth of AI and the transformative effects, which I do, I think it's hard to argue that you're not going to see at least some kind of an air pocket, temporary imbalance of supply and demand in the other direction. And that's when you get really big inflection points in markets.
Well, today we have Jeffrey Emanuel with us, and he is the author of a now somewhat famous or perhaps infamous article called The Short Case for NVIDIA Stock on January 24th of 2025 this year, just a little less than 2 months ago now. NVIDIA closed at a stock price of about $142. And then Jeffrey's article came out on January 25th over the weekend. And then at the end of trading on Monday, NVIDIA had crashed pretty significantly. Then as of yesterday, the stock is all the way down to like $106. So they went from a market cap of roughly $3.5 trillion to a market cap of roughly $2.7 trillion. So it's essentially an $800 billion market cap loss. So that just happens to magically coincide with Jeffrey's article. And so I just wanted to have him come on the podcast to tell the brief story of that. And then we'll get into quite a bit of the interesting and juicy implications for the wider world of AI. We'll talk about Elon and his specific weird corner case in all of this, and then try and get out towards Optimus robots at the end of the conversation as well. So glad to have you with us, Jeffrey. And why don't you introduce yourself and tell us the story?
Sure. Thanks for having me. So I think I can't take responsibility for the full 800 billion, but I do think I have a fair case about that initial Monday crash, which was still 600 billion just in NVIDIA. And if you kind of zoom out, because a lot of other stocks, especially stocks that had a lot of run up on a sympathetic thesis, like data center, air conditioning, like Vertiv, and some of these stocks were down like 35% in the day. And so theoretically, you could say it's something like 1.8 trillion global crack in market cap. And it's not just me, by the way, who is saying that. I mean, I was able to convince Matt Levine from Bloomberg that this was plausible, and he called it, my report, arguably the most impactful short report ever. And MarketWatch wrote a big article about that. So, and I think the reason why I think you can make that argument is because, it's funny because when all the coverage came out in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, they said NVIDIA crashed because of Deepseek, basically, because Deepseek's revelation that they trained this model for so much less. And, and I wrote to both the authors of those articles and said that's obviously not true. You could see on the face of it how it's not true, because first of all, the revelation that it was the Deepseek V3 was trained for less than $6 million came out December 26th, like a whole month before the stock crashed. And not only that, it was sort of like widely discussed, not that widely, but like people like Andrej Karpathy and other kind of important people were talking about it and the implications of it. And then even the reasoning model, the Deepseek R1, that technical report came out a week before and also got plenty of circulation on Twitter and other places and people talking about it and the implications of it. So how could there be a causal link a week later? It suddenly like catches up like that. It doesn't meet the smell test. But the one thing that did change is that, late, like 2, 3 in the morning, something on Friday, I published my piece. And so sort of like zooming out a little, why did I write this thing? There's a couple reasons. I mean, basically, I used to work in the hedge fund industry. And so I long short equity analyst as a generalist. And then, I'm super into AI. I've been into deep learning since like 2010, basically 2010, 11. So kind of way before it was like a famous thing even. And so I follow this pretty closely. And, I still get lunch a lot with my hedge fund friends. And so, the conversation comes to NVIDIA, and a friend of mine was asking me, a few weeks before, maybe 2-3 weeks before the article came out, what could cause NVIDIA to crack? And so I started telling him some of that. And then the Friday I wrote the article, sort of around 3 or 4 p.m., I got a call from this guy. His name's Ross Levin. And he said, hey, have you heard of this Deepseek thing? And I was like, oh, it's funny you should say that, because I literally read both technical reports in a lot of detail this morning. And so I can tell you all about Deepseek and what they did. And I started kind of just explaining it. And he's not that technical. I could tell I was sort of losing him. But I said, this should probably be interesting to a lot of people. And I had already been sort of brewing on some of these thoughts about like what could cause the CUDA moat to, get penetrated or what, And so it's funny because I'm such a bull on AI. Like I'm such a believer that this is like, I'm not one of these guys who's like the cynical, who's always, oh, this is a bubble. Oh, this is all. No, I'm a big, big believer in AI. And so when I first started writing this article at, around like 4 p.m. or something, 5 p.m., the original title was The Short Case for NVIDIA Stock. And then in parentheses, like, if I had to make it. And it was only when I was like 80% of the way done through the article when I realized, like, wait a second, every single hyperscaler is trying to make their own competing custom silicon. I was like, did people really realize that? And then at that point, I removed the parenthetical in the title because I became convinced, no, this thing is like a short. And so, and then it wasn't just like, oh, people might like this article. The other thing is I have this website that I made, YouTube Transcript Optimizer. You can give it like a link to a YouTube video, and it doesn't just turn it into a transcript, but it does that too. It gives you a really high quality transcript, much better than the one YouTube generates. But then it turns it into this very polished written document that's sort of a completely different sort of output. And I just thought it'd be useful for sort of YouTube creators to create additional content from their videos without having to do any work. And so I've been trying to figure out how I can sort of promote that better. And, obviously search ads aren't very, or any kind of online advertising is a pretty bad deal for something like that. And so content marketing, my first blog post was about how I made the website backend. I put that on Hacker News. It was on the front page for, a couple of days, got, 20, 30,000 people reading it. And I thought, great. And I wrote another article that, didn't do that well about this guy who predicted the Russian Revolution. And then I come up with this one, and I was like, I kind of had an inkling that this thing was kind of topical because of NVIDIA, the most valuable company in the world. I mean, it's all anyone talks about, right? It's like NVIDIA and the Magnificent Seven. And then the DeepSeek thing was, already like you could tell there was like, and you could argue why. I mean, I think the main reason is there's a sense, I think there's this sort of fear and, a little bit sort of low level worry in the US that, well, look, China does seem to be ahead of us on some things, manufacturing, but hey, AI, we got them beat, we're way ahead. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, they just leapfrogged. Not only did they catch up in terms of model quality, and it's like the first time I saw a model that's open source that was at that level of quality. And I was blown away because I was like using it to help me understand the technical papers. And so I was blown away with that. And I think that sort of got people like to really notice that, wait a second, they caught up and they did it way more efficiently. This is not, we didn't know about this. And, but in any case, I had an inkling that it would kind of take off a little bit, but I never expected. I mean, basically, I shared it on a couple places. I shared it on Twitter, Reddit. It's funny, I shared it on multiple stock subreddits like Wall Street Bets and stocks, and it got like completely downvoted to oblivion. People mocking it, mocking me, moderators deleting it. Like, I was just like, are you serious? You didn't even want to look at it?
That's Signal.
I was like, whoa, okay, these guys are insane. And then I posted on a website called the Value Investors Club, which is like populated by a lot of sort of hedge fund people. And, I only had like 2,200 Twitter followers at the time I posted it. And, but I could tell it was weird. Like, it takes like almost an hour to read the thing. So there's a little delay, but then the first kind of feedback was that people like really seemed to like it a lot. And then, it basically, one guy who had like 20,000+ followers, a lot of them sort of in FinTwit, financial Twitter, stock people, he really, really liked it and, shared it with this very effusive praise. And that sort of started the thing like kind of burning on fire. And then that spread like crazy from there. And I was just like watching all the traffic on Google Analytics and just, it was like hockey stick kind of. And then, Chamath Palihapitiya shared it, to his, almost 2 million followers. Naval Ravikant shared it to his 2.5 million. The like partner Jared Friedman at Y Combinator shared it, and then it got retweeted by Gary Tan and the official Y Combinator account, which between them is probably another 1.5 million. And ironically, the thing that got shared the most was there's this random guy who does like growth hacking at Dropbox, who only has like 50,000 followers, and he sort of turned it into a kind of a clickbaity like thread that sort of mangled some of my claims and arguments and stuff. But that thing got viewed 13 million times. So he ended up getting more impressions for his thing than everybody else combined who shared the actual long article. But it just went absolutely crazy. And I just started getting just inundated with like, LinkedIn requests and just, it's the most insane thing that's ever happened in my life, basically. And then, so already by Sunday, it was like, people were telling me like, I got sent this by 5 different people today. Like, that's crazy. Like, and it was like basically became this major focal point. And I think the reason is that, there's no shortage of people out there who will sort of opine or pontificate on NVIDIA and AI in the future. But like, if you kind of look at that Venn diagram of like, you have the AI people, and even there, most of them are probably charlatans. And then you have the stock market people, and the intersection of that Venn diagram is like extremely slim. Like most of the stock, even people who run, AI pods at Millennium and, Citadel and stuff, they sort of, they are dilettantes, let's put it in AI. They sort of high level, big picture for me, that's the level they understand it. Whereas I'm sort of like, not only do I understand the sort of how these things work, because I studied math in college, but then also really dug into this stuff when it first sort of became prominent in 2011. But I used these models like extremely intensively all day, every day for programming. And I've just been able to become extremely productive using these things. So I just sort of have a sort of intimate familiarity with these as like, in their most important current economic use case, which is sort of accelerating and boosting the efficiency of and productivity of knowledge work, especially programming. And so, and I think because that allowed me to sort of have some credibility, but not just credibility. It was like the way I sort of presented all the facts in a sort of comprehensive way that, went into the depth. Because I feel like usually articles just, they're too high level, and you need to actually go into the details here to really understand the big picture. And also the fact that I kind of started with, hey, I'm not one of these people who thinks everything's a bubble. I actually do believe in this, but here's why, NVIDIA in particular. And I think a lot of people maybe got the wrong takeaway, which is that, I'm bearish on AI in general. It's like, no, I'm really saying something different, which is that this situation where NVIDIA is going to do triple digit revenue or high double digit revenue growth on this massive revenue base. And they're going to keep earning 90% plus gross margins on their data center products. That situation seems like pretty totally unsustainable to me. And that's sort of the main thesis I had. And so, yeah, and it seems like that a lot of people, once all the facts were sort of laid out and all the arguments and evidence, they decided, whoa, this is, pretty persuasive. And I think just a lot of hedge funds just absolutely panicked and were like, I didn't know this, because I didn't even know it until I actually sat down to sort of, and everything got, crystallized. And then particularly the thing that was incremental was the Deepseek stuff. And, because it was like, wait, and it's funny because there was almost like complete rejection of that. Oh, this is a lie. They're lying about how many GPUs they used. You don't hear quite as much of that claim today now that they've sort of open kimono revealed all the code for a lot of this stuff. But there was all these claims that they're lying, they're subsidizing the inference API, because it was like, wait a second, they're charging sort of GPT-4o mini prices, but for something that's on par with GPT-4o flagship, that's crazy. And in fact, the R1 model, significantly better. That's more like O1 territory, but even better than O1 because it gives you the full reasoning traces. And yet they're pricing this stuff like it's bargain basement, 90+% discount. And so people are like, and so that was the thing that really, and because people yet hadn't come up with, at least immediately with the Jevons paradox stuff, which basically is this idea that as the cost of the, inference, let's say, goes down, well, the demand will go up because now there are all these new use cases that make financial sense. And, I think that's actually an interesting thing to get into a little bit, because there was a lot of people who felt like, oh, well, I could just rebut, this entire article by this simple appeal to Jevons paradox. And I think there was a sort of a lot of sloppiness, intellectual sloppiness in the way people thought about this. For the biggest thing of all is that people didn't differentiate between training and inference. And the thing is, most demand for GPU compute, now and for the past couple years has been on the training side, okay, like pre-training these massive models compared to the inference side. And on the training side, if you have training become a lot more efficient and sort of inexpensive to train a model of a given amount of, IQ, if you will, it's not at all clear that the Jevons stuff applies, because there's only so many levers you can pull. Like you can sort of increase the parameter count, right? Make the model bigger, but that's not like a free lunch, because unless you also have more training tokens, you get very kind of low marginal benefit from doing that. And in fact, the trend has sort of been the other direction, actually. Like GPT-4, the original GPT-4, it was supposed to be a 1.8 trillion parameter mixture of experts model, according to all the leaks and rumors. And I think even Microsoft accidentally revealed that number in some publications. So I think it's pretty reliable. And yet the Deepseek V3 is only 671 billion parameters for comparable quality. In fact, better quality than the original GPT-4. And so the sort of trend doesn't seem to be necessarily going to like get much bigger parameter count. And then even if you did want to do much bigger parameter count, well, where are you going to get all these training tokens from? Deepseek V3 is trained with 15 trillion training tokens. There's not that many more just sitting around latent that haven't been sort of used by anyone. You can probably safely assume that the Chinese don't care that much about American copyrights. So they probably took all the books that are in like LibGen and all these illicit sources of books and stuff. But then the answer people give is, oh, synthetic data. And that's true, but synthetic data is sort of really only helps in a few domains. It helps in domains where you can mechanically verify and validate the results. So you can generate Python programs and then run them and see if they actually run and if they do what you what they're supposed to do, let's say. But you can't do that for like, give me an essay about the causes and effects of the War of 1812. Like you're not going to be able to just get so much better stuff out of what you already have in the model when it comes to anything sort of fact-based. It's things like math, logic, programming. Now, that's very useful. And in fact, the better you get at logic and programming, you kind of get smarter in general for all things. And of course, programming itself is one of the most important economic use cases of these models. So don't get me wrong, it is important, but it's not like this panacea. And so I'm very skeptical. Oh yeah, and the one other kind of lever you can pull is, these big labs, when they're training models like Meta, training the family of Llama 3 models, let's say, they sort of use most of their compute resources on one big set of runs of different sizes, but they're all basically the same architecture. And theoretically, they could say, well, instead of just doing one run, maybe we could do 3 different runs that are kind of slightly different and use different ideas. Because right now, like if they have something that they're not sure of, it's like too risky to put it in the run, because what if it doesn't work? We can't be wasting months of compute with like billions of dollars worth of GPUs. But if you suddenly can do everything 5, 10, 15 times more efficiently, then, why not, right? And so there's some of that's maybe possible. But I would also say, once you get past like 2 or 3 runs, it's like, okay, you really think you're like 6, right? Like it's probably not as great an idea, or you would have done it in the, the first 2 or 3. So, and then on the inference side, where Jevons does apply more, there's all these caveats to it. I mean, I think, first of all, a lot of the use case, especially on the consumer side, it doesn't require chain of thought. So people say, oh, but chain of thought, that's the panacea. Now, all of a sudden, you're going to need 100 times as much compute on the inference side. And my answer is, okay, you don't even need chain of thought for, basically only for things like programming, I'd say, and maybe medical diagnostics or legal analysis, something like that. In many cases, I don't even use chain of thought model. Like if I just want to ask something, sort of factual or about writing, or I'll just use GPT 4.5 because I think it gives a better result. And you don't need, like a lot of stuff doesn't need or benefit from chain of thought, but chain of thought does make it much, slower in terms of latency. And so I'd say there's some drawbacks of it, even ignoring cost. And, a lot of people are using these models for like, oh, give me some ideas for my kid's birthday party. They're not doing something that requires all. The other thing is that, you now have like very kind of distilled models that are pretty small, but very capable. And so to me, it's like, I don't necessarily see that you need to have, that you necessarily are going to get this massive increase because those things were already pretty cheap. Like you could do a lot with, let's say, GPT-4o mini and it was already so cheap, it was almost like too cheap to meter. And like I saw this firsthand with my YouTube transcript optimizer site. When I first made the site, my thinking was, okay, I'll charge users, for credits, maybe like $2 or $3 to do like a 20, 30 minute video. And then I'll probably spend whatever, $1 or something on OpenAI inference, costs for that. Because I originally thought I was going to use GPT-4o for all this stuff. But it turned out that through some careful engineering, by kind of splitting the problem up into a pipeline of smaller prompts that had fewer instructions, and by breaking up the original transcript into smaller chunks, I could keep the context down. I ended up being able to engineer things, so I got incredibly good quality results using GPT-4o mini, which is like 95% cheaper than GPT-4o. And so now basically it cost me a penny or something to do one of these. And so I just have like 99% gross margin on this product before paying Stripe or whatever. And so now, am I going to did I cut my price? Because no, I just kept all that margin because I priced to value. I'm at the app layer. The hard thing for me is to find a customer. That's the hard part. But once I found them, they are getting value from it. I have repeat buyers of credits, so why would I cut price? It's not going to help me drive demand really that much, probably. And second of all, that was how pricing was before DeepSeek. Now, if I got an email from OpenAI tomorrow saying, good news, GPT-4o Mini is now 90% cheaper than it already was, I was like, great. Now, instead of a 99% gross margin, I make a 99.99, like, who cares? Like, it's not going to change anything. And so I think that you can sort of broadly generalize from that to a lot of use cases where, it already was very cheap and kind of cheap enough that you're not going to necessarily see any kind of behavioral changes because of even more discounted pricing, and that it's kind of a subset, a relatively small subset probably of all. I mean, if you just think of how many like software developers even are alive globally, it's like pretty small compared to just the active users of ChatGPT. So it's like clearly a lot of this demand is not high-end programming stuff, So anyway, that's sort of the pushback I have on this. That people think of Jevons as this like panacea that like is going to completely solve this. But maybe I should circle back just to the sort of core arguments of the article. I mean, which is basically like that there are these various sort of reasons that people give for why they're sort of infinitely bullish on NVIDIA in particular. And there are things like, oh, well, they have this incredible moat because of CUDA, that like CUDA is this impenetrable moat. You're never going to be able to compete with them, even if you had great hardware, because the software side, it's like this impenetrable thing. And so I sort of kind of outlined various challenges that are sort of already out there to CUDA and how things could kind of progress from there, especially from their sort of arch enemy or nemesis, AMD, which is, makes actually perfectly good hardware. Until all this deep learning stuff, everybody thought AMD GPUs were pretty competitive on the gaming side, on the crypto mining side, they were fine. And it's like all of a sudden they're unusable for deep learning. And it's like, well, a lot of that is just because of their missteps on the software side, which theoretically they could help correct. And there are these frameworks, like, I mean, basically the crux of that argument is that we could imagine a world where CUDA becomes just one sort of target of compilation of a more general framework, which can also target, let's say, Apple custom silicon or, an AMD GPU or one of these custom silicon chips that we'll talk about in a second. So that's sort of, and then the other thing is CUDA as having mind share across developers. And my point is that you could even see a world where, because one thing where these LLMs are incredibly good is if you already have code that's working, that the code itself becomes like an extremely precise specification for what you want to do. Very unambiguous and clear. And once the model has that, they can really go to town on optimizing it, on porting it. That's where they really, really shine. And so I was sort of speculating about what if like CUDA becomes more of like a specification language where, because programmers already know it, they can just kind of write out their algorithms in CUDA, but then the LLMs can sort of translate that into the corresponding primitives that can target, let's say, these other platforms. And so that's on the CUDA side. And then, but the other really big part of this was that, it's a power law distribution. If you look at where does this demand come from for NVIDIA's really expensive data center products, where the revenues are much bigger. We're talking about $40,000 for a GPU at a 90% margin. So it's costing them, anywhere from $3,500 to $4,000 to make this thing, and they're turning around, they're selling it to Microsoft, Amazon, Google, to XAI, like for $40,000. But maybe they give them a slight discount, but they don't get huge margin. They don't get huge price discounts because they basically can sell everything they make. So even the big guys are not getting like great deals on these things necessarily. And so how is that going to kind of persist if most of that business is coming from like, call it 5 or 6 sort of these customers, these hyperscalers. And then when you kind of dig into it, it's like these companies are not like, they're not like these hopelessly, boomer run, clueless companies. Like these are some of the most impressive technology companies in the world, right? Like Microsoft, they have a very deep bench. They know about hardware, they know about compilers and even chips. And it's like, even if they didn't know about chips, they're like one of the richest, biggest companies in the world. How hard would it be to like hire the guy from NVIDIA who's like disgruntled that he didn't get his promotion and offer to like quintuple his salary, and he can put together his own team, and you're going to give him all these options, and he'll make like, hundreds of millions of dollars if he can make this into a success? It's like the answer is you can hire pretty good people. And then, it takes a little while for them to get a team started, to design the chip, to submit it to TSMC for validation, and to get the thing made. But they started all this stuff already like, a while ago, because the hyperscalers like Amazon and Meta, Microsoft, they saw, whoa, we're spending a lot of money on these things. This is like a choke point for us. We should at least look into what we could do to maybe internalize some of this stuff and get this competency for ourselves, not just to save money, but also because it becomes like a point of differentiation. It's like you can sort of move down on the cost curve and become more competitive, especially for someone like AWS who's trying to sell these services externally. And so, that's the thing that sort of made the light bulb go off for me, that, wow, because I knew that Amazon had their project Inferent 2 and Trainium 2. So both separate projects, one for training, one for inference. And, what I didn't realize is that every one of the hyperscalers had announced already they were making their own custom chips, and that this was just sort of a matter of time before this comes out. And then I think the other thing is that a lot of people take the completely wrong approach to how to think about this. What they say is, well, hold on, NVIDIA's got the head start. They have a flywheel. They have this huge business, so they can spend more on R&D. And it's a moving target, and they're getting so much better. So what are the chances that these guys are really going to be able to come up with a chip that's as good or better than NVIDIA? And I would say, well, of course, obviously. But there's two really big points that you have to make. One is that the NVIDIA GPUs are complete general purpose devices. They're trying to be all things to all people. They're training, they're inference, and it's training any kind of model. Anything you could think of in, PyTorch, it'll accelerate for you. Whereas if you're a hyperscaler, you can be a lot more focused. You could say, you know what, I just want to focus on inference, and I don't care about training at all, because inference is a completely different sort of shape of a problem. And for that, maybe you can find a sort of more custom tailored solution. And there, by the way, it's not just the hyperscalers. You have these two companies, Grok with a Q and Cerebras that are making their own. In the case of Grok with a Q, it's only doing inference, and it does inference like way, way, way faster than even a GPU can, like literally like 6-7 times faster at least, which actually results in a sort of qualitatively different, and I'd say better product in many cases, because you just get the answer back instantly. And so there's that. But then the other thing is that, remember, these things are selling at a 90% gross margin. That gives you a lot of wiggle room, right? So if, let's say you're Amazon, let's say you can't figure out how to match NVIDIA, and your thing is only 1/3 as good, in terms of like price performance. Okay, but the difference is that instead of buying it for 10 times what it costs to make from NVIDIA, you're buying it from yourself at 1 times what it costs to make. You're still way ahead. You're still 3x better off than you were buying from NVIDIA. And then, in fact, you could turn around and you could cut the cost of that to your customer in half, and you're still 50% better than you were under the situation where NVIDIA, but your customers they're twice as better off if they can make their workloads work under that architecture. And by the way, like, we've seen this movie before. We have a very clear kind of history and playbook for this, which is that Amazon, AWS made their own ARM64 server chip called Graviton. And, it used to be like, a few years ago, if you wanted to get an AWS instance to do, server to do stuff on, it's either going to be an Intel or an AMD chip, which means that Amazon had to pay the Intel tax or the AMD, because these companies have, not 90% gross margin, but over 50% gross margin, right? And, but all of a sudden they got their ARM64 server chips working well. And look, it's not an exact apples to apples, but again, with these things, there's always like a power law distribution. Like most compute loads are like, well, we want to run Linux, and then we want to run Postgres SQL, or we want to run Nginx web server or FFmpeg to convert video. All that stuff has already been ported to ARM64 and works great. You don't have to do anything. And even if you have your own custom software, you could port it to ARM64. It's not even that hard. And as a result, they charge a lot less to use their internal chips. And it's sort of a win-win for everyone except for Intel and AMD. It's like Amazon does better because they keep more of the revenues internally. They learn more. They increase their kind of competency. They move lower down on the cost curve. And the customer benefits, if you are able to switch over a lot of your loads to Graviton, you just saved a lot of money. And so we already have a playbook for this. And I think that's something that people really did not kind of understand, which is that they have 10x wiggle room here, that it doesn't have to be even close to as good in absolute terms as NVIDIA to still make all the sense in the world for these companies to deploy this, at scale. And I think a lot of, the issue is that there's just been this bottleneck at the level of like TSMC, where they just could not make enough chips. And, you had Apple and NVIDIA and Bitmain just coming to them with like bags of money and sort of like booking up all their production capacity like well in advance. But that's a solvable problem, right? I mean, they now have this fab in Arizona, and they're now on track to basically, copy paste this thing and make, at least 2 more just like it right next to it, pretty quickly, probably, because the hard part is getting the first one working. So this is a problem that, and maybe it doesn't happen in the next 6 months. Maybe it's not even over the next 18 to 24 months, but it's going to happen. And when you buy NVIDIA for whatever, before my article, 30 times earnings or some large multiple, you're effectively capitalizing this income stream. You're saying that this is going to persist. And so if it's going to actually only last at this extremely elevated level for a couple years before the margins are going to be pressured, and maybe also the revenues, because, you could, in this scenario that I'm outlining, you could still have the hockey stick growth and demand for training and inference, but it's just not all going to NVIDIA now. It's going to a bunch of vendors. And, but the thing is, like, semiconductor margins are not usually that impressive. Like, you look at DRAM is a good, comparison, because, there used to be, like, in the 80s, there were probably like 15 DRAM companies, but they've all kind of consolidated. There's now like 3 of them. It's like, Micron, Samsung, and SK Hynix are like almost all of DRAM. And yet they earn through the cycle gross margins 20%. And even at the very peak of the cycle, they're making maybe 50, 60%. But then at the bottom of the cycle, they're making negative gross margins. So it's like, that's a much more normal kind of boom. Same thing with hard drives and flash memory. It's like, because it only takes 2 or 3 players. You just can't have an effective or de facto monopoly like NVIDIA has. And so you can still be bullish on AI and not think that necessarily NVIDIA has got it in the bag, that they can just continue to just compound at these kind of margins. So
I think from my standpoint, I'll throw it here to you, Hans. One of the things, I'm not nearly as technical as you or Hans in this land, but the thing that never made sense to me long term is it just feels like those 70, 80, 90% margins long term. I don't care what industry you're in, especially in a nascent one with very low competition with what you're doing today. It just feels impossible, especially with the amount of demand. From a very basic analysis perspective, you're really the only player today, kind of. There's a lot of competition coming. There's a tremendous amount and almost unlimited amount of demand in the future for artificial intelligence. For us to think that there's only going to be one player providing compute on either training and inference feels impossible.
Yeah, especially impossible. I agree. The whole history of looking at industries and markets, just you cannot find an exception unless a company had a sort of legal, regulatory granted monopoly of some kind. But if they don't have a monopoly, in law, it's just the market, finds a way, right? And it's like, so you look at like Cisco in, 2000, where it's like you had to have a Cisco router if you wanted to have a .com company, and and nothing else would do. And so they had these huge margins. And guess what? Nowadays, you can get a really good router from Huawei for much less, from Arista. Like, there are all these competitors to Cisco, and they're fine. And maybe even NVIDIA has somewhat of a better moat because of CUDA, but it's not like this. And then
impenetrable.
The other thing about moats is like, maybe it protects you against a frontal assault, but maybe you could still burrow underneath and make a tunnel or shoot a catapult. And that's where you see things like Grok with the Q and Cerberus, where they're like taking a completely different kind of orthogonal strategy. Like, let's do very large wafer scale integration, or let's do, this completely different
statically scheduled inference regime,
exactly,
where you can use an old school process on your chips, and just go with a completely different orthogonal approach to inference,
right.
Period.
And by the way, another thing I want to say is that, you see these power laws everywhere, which is that, we're sort of going through this period of like a Precambrian explosion of diversity in AI. But increasingly, as things kind of develop, I think what you're seeing is more and more demand coalescing behind a few key models. And it makes sense, because if you plot all the models that are out there on this kind of two-dimensional axis, where it's like on the right, it's like price, the cost for 1 million tokens or whatever. And on the vertical axis, it's like the sort of effective IQ, if you will. Each model is a point, and it sort of forms this efficient frontier, Pareto efficient frontier, where you want to choose at any given cost, I want the smartest model. And anything that's like at that cost or higher, that's dumber, why in the world would anyone even want to use it? And so now, which models that are on that frontier, that changes week to week as new models come out. But like at any given time, there's really only a couple of them. And so really what that means is that you just have to, like, if you're a hyperscaler, you can really tailor your inference silicon to work really, really well for those couple models. And if you're doing an annual refresh cycle, or even, semi-annual, whatever, you can sort of just look at, okay, this is the new thing that we need to be able to do really, really fast. That's a lot easier than making something that's general purpose that works for everything. And so it's another thing I think people miss out on, is that you could probably meet large chunks of all the demand with this much more specialized kind of hardware that just, does that one thing that everyone cares about, like, or 80% of the demand is behind, really, really fast and cheap. And then, by the way, all of this argument, I haven't once brought up the Deepseek stuff, but then the Deepseek stuff throws like this huge monkey wrench into everything. Because, look, there's this like backdrop of algorithmic efficiency gains that happen every year, right? And like, Satya Nadella talked about this, in interviews and stuff like that. Oh, we always expect algorithms to get better. That's true. But they expect this improvement to be a little bit more kind of measured pace, maybe a 2x or 3x in a year. And I always laugh, because it's like, in any other industry or space, if you made an air conditioner that was 3 times more efficient, like, you'd take over the whole world market in like a couple of years. But it's like, in this space, we sort of just expect it. But, it's true. If you look at the API inference cost for the GPT-4 when it first came out versus GPT-4o today, it's fallen over 90%. And a lot of that is because of efficiency gains. They were able to distill it down, quantize it, and just make it faster and more efficient to serve. The difference is that, like I said, it tends to be more of a measured pace of efficiency gains, maybe 2.5, 3x in a year. But the much bigger thing is that the big frontier labs, OpenAI, Anthropic, whatever, they have line of sight to this stuff, because it's arising usually from within. And so they know what they're being tested, they know what they're testing, and what's in the lab, sort of what's coming down the pike. And so if you're Anthropic and you're trying to forecast how many GPUs you need, you're doing this analysis, you're looking at your growth rate, you're looking at how much compute you need, and then you're factoring in, well, by that time we'll have this efficiency gain layered in. The difference with Deepseek is it sort of was like a bolt from the blue that was like, this step function increase in efficiency, where it was like much more than the normal one, but it was not telegraphed in advance. It's totally incremental for the most part. And it's very significant in scale. And now we didn't know what this was when my article came out. I just basically was like, look, we know what it costs to train, the llama family of models, and we know what this thing costs. And this thing's like better than the llama models. And so that's one data point. But we can also just look at, to get inference from a model of this quality before, like, was, certainly more than 10 times the price before Deepseek. And so that's another data point. But, people said, look, they're lying. They imported these GPUs and they smuggled them in, and they're just not telling the truth. Or on the training side, and on the inference side, it's, they're, Chinese government subsidizing the inference costs just to drive everyone else, into a loss. Like same thing they did in solar panels, and it was like, no one could really say, but now we can say, because a couple of weeks ago, Deepseek did what they called their week of open source. And each day they kind of dropped a new piece of open source software. And on day 6 of that, they dropped their super efficient inference stack. And they, not only that, they basically gave you a sort of economic snapshot of what it looks like to serve, whatever, a day or two of inference from their perspective. And not only are they not losing money on inference, they're earning like 80+% gross margins. Okay, like they're selling it for more than 5 times what it costs them to generate these tokens. And they actually told you exactly how many tokens they can generate a second. And this is on H800 hardware, which is like the H100 is sort of like now it's being replaced with the Blackwell B200s, but the H100 was the sort of standard NVIDIA data center GPU. And once they started passing these export restrictions, the version that's sold to China is called the H800, which is the same chip, except they sort of handicapped its memory bandwidth in a significant way. And it's funny because we thought this would slow these guys down, but it actually, gave them all this incentive to really come up with these genius workarounds. And they did. They came up with these brilliant things that sort of sidestepped the problem by just being really clever. And so, yeah, I mean, and so you can actually do the math. And I did, like, it's funny because they gave it to you in this form that no one can make sense of. And all I did was I knew how many tokens a second you could get on a pretty good model with an H100. And I just was like, okay, so what they're saying, it's like about 7 to 8 times as efficient as, what we thought was the sort of, at least the open source state of the art on, it's not exactly apples to apples because that's on an H100, which is faster. But in any case, even if you say that the big labs or big hyperscalers already have done some of these clever things that aren't public, it's still probably 4 or 5 times as efficient what the Deepseek guys were doing and what they've now open source. So, which is just a matter of time now. They probably, at this point, the big labs probably had already made their own version of this stuff internally. But even if they've been slow with that, now they have the actual code from Deepseek. They could just fold it right in. And sort of my immediate reaction to that is, whatever you thought the situation was in terms of like what, we have inference demand and GPU compute availability, capacity in the market. And whatever you thought the sort of gap was there, the supply demand imbalance, okay, which is, we've been in this kind of shortage situation. That's why you see all this kind of craziness in the market, right? It's like you're in this kind of acute shortage where people are desperate, so desperate that, a company like Microsoft, which certainly has the money and, know how to just buy GPUs directly from NVIDIA, is like signing these multi-billion-dollar deals with a company called CoreWeave, which like literally all they had was a bunch of GPUs that they had just gotten early before the GPUs became, in shortage. And so, clearly we've been in an acute shortage. So, but whatever you thought the situation was before DeepSeek came out, you sort of now have to revise and say, wait a second, if inference just got at least 4 or 5 times more efficient, then unless you basically have essentially overnight a 4 or 5x increase in inference demand, okay, the market is going to be looser than you thought. And so whatever your plans were, and I think a lot of people get this wrong. They say, but Satya said that he's still good for his 80 billion. And Zuck doubled down on the call saying that they're still going to spend this money. And I'm like, guys, there's a very long lead time here that you have to lock this stuff in advance, especially recently because it's, they've been able to dictate terms. NVIDIA has been able to say, you have to make firm commitments if you want to guarantee supply. And so what you're seeing now is like, basically, look, they don't want to just, if you're Zuck, you don't want to look like an idiot and be like, oh, I bought 10 times more GPUs than we can effectively use. And so of course you say, no, everything's great. And so the real question is, the next time a contract goes on Zuck's desk that now he has to commit new capital, incremental new commitments on CapEx for GPU compute, what's he going to do? How's he going to think about it? And same for Satya and all the other guys. And my answer to this is like, it seems quite obvious that you'd at least want to pump the brakes a little bit and see where you stand. And that once you've folded in these DeepSeek efficiency gains, how's it going from there? Do we actually have more, slack capacity than we thought? Because the last thing you want is to have a bunch of very expensive, very quickly depreciating GPUs sitting there being underutilized, because these things are losing value very dramatically. You might depreciate them over a straight line, 5-6 year useful life. But the reality is that after 1 year, when the B200 Blackwell comes out, your H100 suddenly now it's like probably half as value, 40% less, and then it's just quickly, just within a couple of years, it's like nobody even wants these things practically.
Yeah.
And so it's the last thing you want is to have these things sitting there being underutilized. But then it's an even bigger argument in favor of delay, defer, as much as you can, because if you're a hyperscaler, that you're eventually going to be able to get your own internal custom silicon, which is way better off for you to switch to. It's just a question of when are you going to get that? And so the longer you can go to sort of bridge the gap before you could start swapping out your much more cost-effective custom silicon, makes all the sense in the world to do that. And so so I've been making this argument from the beginning, but now you're starting to see these news articles about like, Microsoft trying to get out of some data center contracts and, maybe walking away from some CoreWeave business and all this kind of stuff. And and by the way, that's all on the sort of supply or effective supply side. But then you look at the demand side, obviously demand's growing. There's all these new AI startups, chain of thought is an increase in sort of the number of tokens being generated. But I think actually, there's been a bit of a surprise at how slow big companies are, not tech companies, but just big corporate giants, like how slow they've been to integrate and implement this stuff that's sort of already out there. And like an example I like to give to people is, you already have advanced voice mode for OpenAI, on their iPhone app, for example. And if you haven't tried this before, you absolutely, if you pay the $20 a month, you just press the button and it talks to you in this completely natural sounding voice that's like unbelievable. It doesn't sound like a robot. It sounds like a person. You can interrupt them. They can talk with emotion. And then it's like all the intelligence of, an OpenAI model like GPT-4o, and it can search the internet and it can do all this stuff. And it's like, so everything you would need, like to do like a customer service agent at, let's say, American Express that can handle like most customer requests. Because really what happens when you call up American Express and you like lost your card or something, you're getting connected to some call center, usually in a place like India. And then the person is just looking up the script, for your problem, lost their card. And it's just essentially reading like this. You could just fold that into, these. So this stuff is all there, but they haven't done it yet. And that's the thing. It's like corporate America is kind of lagging behind actually integrating. So even though theoretically you could see this massive skyrocketing demand, I don't think it's happening quite as quickly as you might imagine based on just the state of the technology. And so you put all this together, and this is sort of the core of my argument, is that even if you still believe in the hockey stick growth of AI and the transformative effects, which I do, I think it's hard to argue that you're not going to see at least some kind of an air pocket or temporary imbalance of supply and demand in the other direction. And that's when you get really, really big inflection points in markets. It's when you go from acute shortage to at least temporarily acute surplus. And I say acute surplus, that might just be temporary. And then the hockey stick takes over and people put the brakes on new capacity. But that's sort of like, even that's a little bit wishful thinking because you keep getting these efficiency gains. And, it's like the Deepseek stuff, if that weren't bad enough, I mean, like a week ago, you had Alibaba's Quen team. They came out with an announcement that they have this new model. And they claim at least that, and I think it's probably somewhat true for programming tests, maybe not in general, but they have a model that they say performs as well as Deepseek R1 with the V3 base model, which is a 671 billion parameter base model. And the Alibaba Quen model is 32 billion parameters. That's 1/20th of the parameter count and thus memory footprint, which means and that's a gating factor for a lot of these, inference serving costs. It's, like how much memory you have in each GPU. And so now you're telling me it's like I could get the same kind of quality results, at least for programming questions, with 5% of the, on top of the, you already were like anywhere from, 4 to 8 times more efficient in inference with the big 671 billion parameter. And now you're telling me I could do that with 5% of the footprint. It's like, so these efficiency gains just keep getting, and yet I would say that the sort of average difficulty of requests that come in is not going up by that much. It's like, still, it's a lot of people like, help me with my kids' homework and my kids in 4th grade. And it's like, these models don't break a sweat with that now, And so, but even if you're sort of optimistic, there's still going to be this sort of temporary air pocket. And then all kinds of stuff changes now in the way you have to think about things. Like all of a sudden, forget even just NVIDIA, where NVIDIA might have a harder time sustaining the margins and the growth, right? I mean, you see this you see this all the time. Like under COVID, a lot of companies had this massive increase in demand driven by COVID. Companies like that make the cans for beer, like people couldn't go out to bars, they're buying more cans of beer. And so these 2 companies, Ball and Crown Castle, that make the aluminum cans, they usually would spend $600 million a year in CapEx. Then suddenly they're spending $1.5 billion to keep up with the capacity. And then it's like, as soon as like COVID ends and people are going to bars again, it's like, oh, they're not now they're actually declining in volume. You see this left and right in the economy, where when you go from sudden supply demand imbalance in favor of the industry to now there's kind of excess or slack capacity, and it can be devastating to these companies' margins. And I'd say it's especially acute for companies that sort of have just been sort of ancillary beneficiaries of these cycles, this mega trend recently, like these companies that make power equipment or that are sort of boring industrial type companies, but they suddenly got this big bolus of additional incremental revenues at very, very high margins, and they have largely fixed cost base. And so it's just had this very disproportionate impact on their earnings and free cash flow. And now they're going to be lapping this. And now all of a sudden it could be, you could see some of these companies, or this company Vertiv that makes the cooling equipment for data centers. I mean, this company, I think their earnings went up like 250% in 2024, where it was like probably the stock that went up the most practically in the S&P 500. And it's like, how much could that thing go down because they're on the leading edge of like new data center capacity. That's sort of like the first thing that people are, if you were about to sign that contract for the next one, that's the one you definitely want to maybe hold out on just to see, take the pulse of things. And so I think you could see like this sort of pretty big impact. And by the way, that's why people said, oh, wasn't it an overcorrection on that Monday? And I'd say, I'm not so sure about that, because it's like, yes, it's a big move in one day, but it's like the market sort of catching up to what it should have done before. It just didn't realize. And it suddenly got that information and that argument all presented on a silver platter in my article, and then it suddenly realized, and that you've seen the correction. And I think it's interesting how, it crashed on that day down to like 117, 118. And then over the next month, it sort of crept back up almost all the way back. And it's funny because everyone was saying, oh, they're going to they're going to have great earnings and great guidance. And this is where you have to take a step back if you're an investor. There are plenty of people who know about AI experts. They do not understand the stock market. The stock market's a completely different thing. If it were so easy to do well in the stock market, then anybody with like sort of a high IQ would be really, really rich. But that's not the case. It takes more than just pure IQ. You have to understand how markets work. There's a lot of meta stuff in markets and so it's sort of like you have to almost dedicate your life to understanding markets if you want to understand that well. And so all these people were just convinced that they thought it was this simple calculation that NVIDIA, if they beat what the analyst estimates are for the quarter, and the guidance is also above what the analyst sell side, which is already funny because it doesn't even matter what the sell side thinks anymore. It's all about what the buy side, what the whisper number is anyway, which people didn't even understand that layer of meta to it. But what they really didn't understand, and I've been saying very consistently this whole time, which is that I'm sure NVIDIA is going to have great earnings because that was all baked in a long time ago with these long lead times. And I'm sure they'll have great earnings in next quarter. But it's like that was priced in already. People were assuming that. And what really matters is sort of like what's coming on the other side. And when you start seeing that the future is incrementally worse than you would have thought previously, that's when stocks start to move. It's all about the future. And so I think you've seen that, and so, yeah, sure enough, they had the great results, great guidance. Stock has been falling like a rock. And it's like people are so quick to say, oh, this is because of Trump's tariffs. And it's like, no, if you didn't have this idiosyncratic stuff going on about Deepseek and, this other, my article had never come out it was sort of isolated from everything else. It was sort of levitate. People knew about, the risk of tariffs already, and it wasn't a problem. So I don't buy that for a second. I think this is just the market being rational, that all the arguments that I just made are sort of, they're almost incontrovertible if you really think about it. And at the very least, you can't ascribe them zero probability. And as soon as you start giving it even 20, 30% probability, well, okay, that already explains the decline in these stocks that you've seen already. And this hasn't even come to pass yet. And so the second you start really seeing this, where these efficiency gains lead to like huge amount of slack, and you have these companies that are just like, and then you have companies like CoreWeave, which is trying to IPO, soon at a $35 billion valuation. And this is a company that I don't even know why this thing exists practically. It's like a bunch of these three commodity traders who tried to make a Bitcoin mining company. And then they realized that they could do this like opportunistic pivot to AI. And it was early enough that they were able to just buy a lot of GPUs from NVIDIA right before NVIDIA's, GPUs became like the new gold. And so they're just sitting. And the funny thing about it is like, they don't even own the buildings, like the data center. They're owned by these REITs and stuff like Digital Realty Corp. And they finance a lot of this stuff with debt. And it's like, they're not a technology company. They don't really, they sort of are, but they don't have like real special sauce software or any, like there's a lot of GPU infrastructure as a service companies like Lambda Labs. And like, there's a lot of players, not to mention AWS and Azure, stuff like that. So I don't even understand what, but they managed to sign these big deals, like Microsoft, 62% of their revenues last year. And it's like, okay, Microsoft uses them. And I'm like, just use your head. Why does Microsoft need these guys? It's because they had a line on these GPUs. And I joke that CoreWeave is like the WeWork of AI, because if you look at WeWork, they were signing these like long-term, leases, master leases on office buildings or floors of office buildings for 10, 15, 20-year terms. And then they're turning around and renting it out for at most a year, but often month to month or even daily hot desks. Yeah. And so when COVID hits and demand suddenly dries up, they still have to pay their lease payments, but their revenues are collapsing. They go and they have a lot of debt, and they go bankrupt very quickly. And I think you could see a scenario like that with CoreWeave.
Yeah, I think this is all super, super interesting stuff that I don't think is heard very often in this land. Because all this stuff that you're sharing is super, super insightful. I know we want to hit XAI, we want to hit Tesla Bot. I just want to thank you for all the information you've shared with us, because it's very counter to what's heard often, right, in the market.
Yeah, I think maybe this would be a great point for us to start to pivot a little bit towards. I all of those points, I agree with. I have a hard time, even though we've gone back and forth a little bit on X, just thinking through all of it. Your rebuttals are always very solid. Like if NVIDIA is going to continue to grow through this, it's going to require them to invent basically either new markets or to innovate in certain ways. Like there's nothing that you can point to that they have in the bag already that secures those types of future growth opportunities. But the one thing that I have a hard time ignoring is just looking at Elon. He's been kind of an early canary in the coal mine on several of these types of issues in the past, that he was one of the first ones to really try to go head to head with NVIDIA in his own applications, whether that was at Tesla with Dojo, trying to displace NVIDIA GPUs, and for their specific video style training that has proven very difficult to do. But he was doing that really before you saw the hyperscalers aggressively going after this. Now he's kind of pivoted and come back to NVIDIA. And so I guess one question is, do you see that real world AI problem set being a problem set where NVIDIA might have a persistent advantage just because it is right at the frontier? The generality of the platform makes that easier. And that's just one of the things that Jensen has always done a good job of, was really trying to provide the maximum amount of support for people at the frontier to do, work that actually that was effective for researchers, that they didn't have to worry about all of the lower levels of the stack, and they could really just push the pedal to the metal on trying to understand new applications of deep learning.
Sure. So, there's a lot of things I can say to that. So, well, first of all, I would say clearly they have an advantage and a moat. Or we wouldn't even be talking about this. Like, there's a question of is there any probability that the moat is sort of penetrated at least somewhat? And I think, I think Elon is a good case in some ways because even though maybe they haven't displaced the NVIDIA GPU so much on the training side, my understanding is that they do use their own custom silicon in the cars themselves
and have for years and years, 100%. Like they've never, in fact, I'm not sure that it was even an NVIDIA chip that was used when they had the Mobileye. It may have been an NVIDIA chip in the Mobileye computer, but that if it was NVIDIA, that would have been the last time that it wasn't a Tesla custom silicon. And I believe Jim Keller was one of the ones who came in with Pete Bannon, and they developed the Hardware 3 computer, and they've been on that and the subsequent follow-on iterations of that hardware, both for the car and now for the Optimus robot since then.
So I think that's an important sort of dichotomy again of this training versus inference, right? And so, on the inference side, it's a lot easier to make your own custom silicon, which is what I was sort of saying earlier about the hyperscalers. But also, it makes sense to do that where you can. The thing with the training is because once you're doing inference, you sort of already know what model you're trying to do inference on, and you can sort of optimize the design for just that problem. You don't need to have this general purpose thing that can do everything. But on the training side, it does help to have this kind of flexibility that you can try all sorts of new ideas and approaches, and you haven't backed yourself into a corner. But I'd also say it's you have to sort of know your edge, I think, and making your own custom silicon for training, if you're the only user of it, it's sort of harder to make that math on that work. Whereas if you're AWS, if you're Azure, but especially AWS, you're not just doing it for yourself, you're doing it for all these other customers. So if you can amortize the costs, because there's all these non-recurring engineering costs associated with making a new chip. And you can amortize that over hundreds of customers. or thousands of customers, it's a lot easier to justify having a pretty big project with a lot of headcount, By the way, one thing I just forgot to say earlier is that as innovative and great as NVIDIA is, ultimately, TSMC is the one making these chips, and they're using ASML, machines to do it, with Carl Zeiss lenses, and it's going to be the exact same stack for Apple silicon, and then the AWS silicon, and then Microsoft silicon. And so it's not like there's this sort of like alien artifact that no one knows how to make anything even like it a little bit. It's like, no, we can make, and I think it's interesting that this M4 Ultra chip that just came out from Apple, I think it has like 185 billion transistors, but the latest Blackwell B200 is like 208 billion. So it's almost as many, like 89% as many transistors. Now they're different, they're used for different things, but it just tells you, like, if you use transistor count as a sort of, on the same
proxy
size, wafer as or chip as a proxy for complexity, it's like, and by how much those chips go for compared to the 40,000, TPU, it's like a lot less, right? So, but going back to Elon, I think in the case of XAI, there's a strong feeling that he sort of lost time because of his sort of abortive relationship with OpenAI, that he thought he was going to be part of that group doing all this work. And then maybe he got kind of distracted with SpaceX and Tesla. And then all of a sudden the LLM stuff became hugely more relevant because of the explosion in capabilities. And then he's like, I really have to catch up. The only way to catch up is to do like extreme skunk works, like parallel track everything. And, you look at how quickly they put up that data center, where they didn't wait for the utility to like get the power to it. They got like 90, semi trailers with like, I think it was like
generators.
Yeah, it was like 30% or so, or 40% of all the mobile generation capacity in the US is like parked outside their data center. And then they have like on the other side of the building, there's like all the portable HVAC equipment to cool it all. Like no one else does that kind of, like 3 months, and they just go start to finish and put up the whole thing. The only way to do that is to just take the off the shelf GPUs and guarantee enough, volume to, to Jensen to guarantee the supply, and, put up the money, and the last, it takes a long time to make a chip, right? And get it all completed and get it all delivered, even ignoring the capacity bottlenecks. And so I think that's mostly what that's about, which is that like Elon was in a huge freaking rush, and that's the fastest way to get. And guess what? It worked, because Grok 3 is a wonderful model. I was skeptical that it would be competitive. And it's like, if your model's like not as good as the kind of frontier models, it's almost like, what's the point, right? Like why, like there are all these companies making LLMs. Like I remember Databricks made a pretty big, 180 billion parameter model, like R1 or something. And it was like, it wasn't state of the art practically the day it came out, and very expensive to serve it. And it's like, okay, what is it? This has zero economic value to anyone. Even Databricks shouldn't.
Yeah, it's not on that frontier.
Yeah, it's not even close
that you're talking about.
And or the even funnier example is Bloomberg LP, the financial company, trained at great expense, hired a ton of people, and they took all the financial filings and all the data that only Bloomberg had in such a clean, nice form, and trained a model on it. And guess what? It got beaten soundly by GPT-4, which is a completely generic model, on every single downstream task they tried it on. So it's like a lot of these companies shouldn't even be bothering training models in the first place. But Grok 3 is like really, really good. It's incredibly good for a debut model. I mean, not even for a debut model, just period. But the fact that it's a debut model, it's like mind-blowing. And so clearly that was the right decision. And, look, there's more than one way. Like, again, they're also not necessarily in the business of trying to sell, capacity to other people to run their models.
The API business.
Or even the API, they still haven't released their API. I'm sure they'll do that, but it's not going to be their sort of necessarily their biggest focus for this. I think the real reason he made this is, to sort of, make a ChatGPT-like consumer product and with a built-in audience that has built-in kind of access to all of the Twitter data. And then the other big reason, of course, is that as soon as the Optimus robot's ready, that's going to be its brain, because it's a multimodal model, and it's the prefrontal cortex for Optimus. And so it just seems like obvious. Like, now I'm sure Optimus will probably also have essentially the same chip used for full self-driving, and that's how it'll navigate around the world and stuff. But then once you ask it a question and say, hey, can you clean up my living room, the way it's going to do the task planning and stuff is going to be using its LLM, which will probably be like, Grok 4, Grok 5, whatever the hell it is. And so that... and
may even have Starlink direct-to-cell technology.
I hope so,
yeah. So it can do that out in the middle of the woods and be connected to...
people I think are too focused on but it only gets 2 hours of charge. It's like, first of all, this isn't solved so easily. You get 4 or 5 batteries, and you have a mobile smart robot. It can just go around and it can just like plug in the second battery and swap out this. If it has 2 batteries inside its body, so that it can go into kind of a low power mode when it takes one of them out. And then it can just swap them itself and get power all day. Also, in the context of like a factory floor, like you could do things like use inductive charging in their feet, where they're like constantly getting trickle charge from the floor or whatever. Like just there's a zillion things. They can literally just be tethered, like as long as they don't trip over the wires, like, especially if they're on a gantry system, suspended. There's a lot of things you could do about that. But yeah, having connectivity, that'll be big, because it's always going to be more efficient to do certain things in the cloud, because you get those economies of scale and, things like cooling and stuff like that. And so I wouldn't be surprised, actually, if some of that stuff, the heavy duty cognition, if you will, if, maybe it can do it locally if it has to, and it'll run a little bit slower and use more battery. But if it does have fast enough connectivity, it probably offloads that to the cloud. And that's another kind of use case for XAI. And so, and because they're not as focused, they're certainly not focused on being a infrastructure as a service play. So to them, making their own GPU, I think it's sort of irrelevant. But I do think they will have their own inference solutions, just like they do for the cars. And even if they don't have it in Gen 1, like it just becomes like a unit economics thing. Like once you start selling a certain number of them, just like with Microsoft or just like with AWS, once your total revenues from GPU compute exceed a certain number of billions of dollars, it's like, okay, now we're really wasting a lot of money now by not having our own version of this. So what the hell are we doing? Like, we could make this pay for itself very quickly. And that's where all this kind of pressure comes from, I think, is just ultimately like, if it's all like on the come anyway, it's like, okay, fine. There's no rush to do it now. But as soon as you are in a position where, as soon as you had this chip, you'd be able to start saving tens of billions of dollars. It's like, okay, well, how much does it even cost to develop this thing? Not that much. So this is a no-brainer.
So before we get too much further into Optimus or any of the other topics, one of the things that I've heard mixed commentary on is this idea of the fact that Grok was trained on a completely coherent NVIDIA cluster that was, 100,000. We assume that now that at the 200,000 H100 equivalents that it's still coherent. We haven't heard any confirmation on that, but I've heard some people say that the reason that Grok 3 has this incredible performance was that it was able to be trained on this coherent cluster that was 3 times bigger than the next largest coherent cluster at least. And so maybe that would be like the Gavin Baker camp. And then I've heard other people say, well, the fact that Grok 3 wasn't like dramatically better than O3 proves that you've kind of hit a wall on the marginal returns that you're getting training on a larger coherent cluster. How do you...
Well, what about GPT 4.5? I mean, GPT 4.5 is sort of the best more recent data point where it's not a reasoning model, but look, I mean, I'm sort of ambivalent a little bit about 4.5 because I love it I use it for a lot of things. It's really awesome at writing. It's great at like anything fact-based. Like if you're doing some medical diagnostic thing, it'll have more encyclopedic knowledge about like all the side effects of like every drug because it just has more parameters. It can just fit more kind of fact-based knowledge about the world. But its performance on a lot of important downstream tasks like programming and stuff is like not that much better, but the cost to serve are just absolutely gargantuan. Like it's like 20 times more expensive, 15 to 20 times more expensive than GPT-4o. That's like a really big. Like, and it's not 20 times better. But it's like maybe it's like 14% better or something like that. So you're talking about 15 to 20x inference cost, at least 10x training cost to get a 14% performance gain. And then it's like it's actually so expensive. Like I don't even think it really makes sense to use it as the base of a reasoning model because that would really get very expensive. Maybe you distill it down to a smaller version, heavily quantized, that could then be a great base for a reasoning model. I'm sure they'll do that.
Or at the very least, do what Deepseek did and, not run inference on every single expert in the mixture of experts architecture while you're...
Sure. But going back to your question about coherent clusters, I think that's very real. I mean, when every node is exactly the same, every node has the same memory bandwidth, same CPU speed, it just simplifies the way you could reason about this training. Training is all about sort of perpetuating this fictional abstraction that you have one computer, not a bunch of like not a bunch of sort of separate nodes that have to communicate with each other. And that's a lot easier to think about if you could think about each GPU even across physical computer boundaries. Like, these are different, CPU like controlling, this.
Yeah, almost thinking about them like cores instead of
separate. Exactly. And the thing about like when whenever you see these multi-core chips, like in an AMD CPU that has 32 cores, usually all 32 of those cores are the same. And because that means that they run at the same clock speed or maybe not necessarily that, but like they have the same memory bandwidth. And it simplifies things because now you can think about them as all kind of being fed data. I mean, where things get off kilter is when one thing, one part of it is going faster than another part, and now they kind of get out of sync, and the one part can't continue the calculation until it gets the results from this other part, and it kind of gets this bottleneck and kind of traffic jam, if you will. And so if every, compute unit is consuming data at the same speed and processing the data at the same speed, it's sort of simple. You could think of it almost as like, those champagne glass things where you just pour the water, champagne at the top and it flows nicely into all of them at the same rate. They all fill up at the end, if you did it right, they all basically have the same amount of champagne in them and everything's great. Whereas if you have some of them are A100, some of them are H100s, some B200s, and maybe some weird custom silicon things, then it's going to be all screwed up and you're going to have some of the glasses overflowing while the other ones barely got any in them. And then you get more bugs and problems. You have to like stop the training runs and store them from checkpoints. And you just get these numerical stability problems that's like the sort of good case is that you realize that the thing crashed and then you can restore it from the backup. The sort of more insidious case is where you don't realize that anything's
I just lost billions of dollars.
Well, no, it's not even that. It's like, I'd say that's obviously the disaster case too, in which case you would just restore from a checkpoint. But no, the worst is when your model's just subtly like getting dumber, but you don't. It's like when you do a bad quantization of a model where it's like you can't even put your finger on it exactly, but it just lost some IQ points. It's like getting hit in the back of the head with a lead pipe, but you don't even know that it happened. And it's like getting slightly dumber, or in some cases you don't even have the counterfactual because you never got the model trained in a coherent way. And so it's just subtly worse in ways that maybe could have been avoided if you did have a coherent cluster. And yeah, sure, there's some truth to that. But I mean, I think also it's like the way people were taking pre-training scaling before all this, I think was too extreme. People talking about, the Stargate, that, okay, we went from, $1 to $2 billion training clusters to $10 to $15 billion. Okay, now the next stop is $100 billion. And it's just like, well, does that really make sense? Do we even have enough training tokens to make this work? Does it really make sense to have these massive models? Or are there actually much smarter, more elegant algorithmic approaches to getting better performance? And if that's the case, and it's interesting. So I gave you the sort of analysis how I processed the Deepseek news when it was like, oh, they have 7-8 times the inference efficiency. And I said, oh, well, that means, inference has to go up by this amount or else you're going to have more slack. But another analysis that I've seen, that which I have not independently, re-derived, but I've seen now 2 different people on Twitter kind of post about this, which is that if you simply take the Deepseek inference efficiency and you extrapolate that across sort of all the GPUs that are already in existence in data centers out there in the world today, that means that we have enough existing GPU compute capacity that it's enough to generate 10,000 tokens a day for every man, woman, and child on planet Earth of like an R1v3 level model, which is, basically state-of-the-art model. And it's like demand is not even remotely that high because there's a lot of people in like rural China and India who don't use any tokens, right? And it's like, so it's just sort of another independent data point that it's like these efficiency gains are very impactful, in terms of like, sort of doesn't matter how you slice it or think about it, that these are very big increases here. But yeah, look, on the training side, yeah, the coherence is look, and this is why NVIDIA, no one's arguing that NVIDIA is like going away. But, the B200's already, first of all, the H100's still very capable, right? And there's a lot of these out there. And so using these training efficiencies, right? Because a lot of these Deepseek things, they're applicable in all these different cases, right? Like it's sort of H100, B200, you could do all the same tricks you were doing before, but then layer in these tricks that they came up with. And now it's like you thought you were getting a 1 gigawatt data center. Now you really actually got a 5 gigawatt or 10 gigawatt data center effectively, right? And so it's sort of like that buys you a lot of, even if you still agree with everything that you were saying about coherence is good, blah, 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 you can now train a much bigger, better model, with the thing you already had, right? Like, and so, but that's not even the situation. The situation's like even way worse than that. It's that all these B200s, which are much faster, much more VRAM, much more memory bandwidth, many more cores than the H100, they've already been ordered. They've already sold over 12 billion of these things, in the last quarter, and shipments are ramping. And these are already like spoken for. They're already like gonna go into effect. And so if we're already in an effective like surplus situation, once everybody does implement these now look, one point to make is that, Deepseek efficiency gains aren't necessarily directly applicable to every model that already exists. Okay. Like, for example, a lot of these things are sort of peculiar to an MOE, mixture of experts architecture. And so if you're talking about a completely dense model like Llama 3.3, 70 billion, maybe doesn't, directly carry over. But my answer to you is like, first of all, who the hell wants to use that model? It's now been outclassed by something that's a lot cheaper. And second of all, like whatever Llama 4 was going to be, it's been scrapped and they're, doing it over using these tricks because they'd be crazy to not, they'd be like Databricks where it's like dead on arrival. Like it's not going to be state of the art on day one. There's no point in doing it. And you're better off taking longer to come up with something that's at least state of the art for a few weeks, And so, and I think what's interesting about Deepseek too is like they sort of inverted the process. Like if you look at the way these models normally, it's like the theoretical teams at these big labs are sort of separate from the engineering teams in some way, where they sort of architect the model and they say, all right, this is the model, we got it prototyped, Now we're handing it over to you to figure out, the engineers to figure out how to make this thing run really fast. And I think with Deepseek, they kind of started with, how can we make something?
How do we make it run fast?
How do we make it run fast? Not only that, how can we make it run fast on our crippled H800 GPUs? Because that's what we really can buy a lot of, which means super strong emphasis on reducing memory footprint and kind of the interconnect bandwidth that's required, because that's where they crippled it, is on the memory bandwidth. And so these smart algorithmic changes about doing stuff with like better kind of communication protocols, and like, but also just doing stuff at lower precision everywhere you can get away with it. And especially on these KV indices and stuff, where you're able to train the thing end to end in this lower precision way, as opposed to training it in the high precision and then quantizing it, at the end. That means like, it just benefits you all across the board. I mean, you get the benefit of like, you can do it on fewer GPUs, right? Because it takes up less memory. But it's also like you could feed the data to the chip faster because it's shoveling it in a more compressed format. But also it's like on the interconnect, when you're doing node to node communication, you're sending less data over the wire because it's like in a sort of reduced precision.
Yeah, I mean, it's less computation on literally every single forward and back pass.
Yeah, and not just more, it's less data. It's like it's just so you're sending less over the wire. So it's like this win-win-win. That's, by the way, why the gains are so huge, is because they're these discrete things, but then the combined impact is multiplicative, where you have to multiply, like, oh, this gets you a 1.8 times boost, this gets you a 2.2 times, and then you have to multiply them together. That's how you can get these really big numbers. And so, yeah, I would say like just from all the stuff that's already been ordered and that's coming, and like you have a lot of compute to do a whole hell of a lot of innovation and improvement in state-of-the-art model. And then beyond that, it's like, barring some other big algorithmic invention, and I'm not talking now about necessarily efficiency gains, although that's also a big part of it. I'm talking about things like reasoning is like this sort of separate dimension that got added on to pre-training, where it just gave you all this new capabilities, like in a kind of different axis. It's got to be something like that, something more kind of innovative, where it's like, oh, we got a new optimizer that's better than Atom, like this thing Muon or Shampoo that people are talking about, or like we got, and it just finds sort of different, better models using pre-training, or there's this new stuff like diffusion LLMs, where like they, instead of generating tokens sequentially, like in an autoregressive way, they do it sort of as a noise reduction process, like the way image gen models work. Something like kind of radically different and new that comes out, that's like, I'd say barring that kind of thing, we're sort of like, getting to the point where the benefits seem to be slowing down on just doing the vanilla transformer on bigger parameter count models with more tokens, because like I said, like we're sort of out of training tokens that aren't synthetic, and certainly not enough to really move the needle in terms of like text, that's not synthetically generated. And then it's like, or you run into this problem of like, okay, the model's great, but who's going to pay 20 times as much per token for that? It's not like the other ones are good enough. I'll take the one that costs a nickel instead of $1, So that's sort of my answer. And look, all this stuff goes back to like, on the day I wrote that article, NVIDIA and a lot of these companies were sort of like pricing in like none of this stuff, even though it had already happened effectively. You just had to connect the dots and sort of like do the
narrative.
The narrative and the math, and just figure out what are the implications of all this. And that's sort of what the market's kind of caught up to now. And where it's like, no matter what else even happens, even if like you didn't have the Trump tariffs and all this other stuff that people are talking about, there'd still be this overhang, I think, and that would be spooking people.
So one of the dynamics that I see in operation among especially the big hyperscalers is this arms race on, feeling like if they don't have the ability to control their own destiny with a frontier model, that potentially their whole company goes kablooey. And that's why, Zuckerberg is willing to invest at the level that he's willing to invest in. Satya is willing to do a deal with someone as upcoming and unstable as Sam Altman to begin with. And, some of these dynamics. And what I'm wondering is, with Elon kind of showing that there is maybe still frontier progress room left to be made with these larger coherent models, and NVIDIA being really the only provider who can really put that scale of identical compute units together to do those large coherent training clusters. If even, notwithstanding everything that we've talked about, that maybe 2 or 3 players, as long as they feel like there's, that the race is still on and that it hasn't been decisively won, that a few of them will just continue to try to chase Elon in building these big clusters. I'm
skeptical. I just, because I think, if anything, things are starting to point the opposite direction, which is that the model intelligence is sort of becoming commoditized. And that what we thought was the big competitive edge and differentiator, that sort of narrative started collapsing when Deepseek R1 with V3 came out, where it was like, this model's like really good and really cheap and was trained for cheap amount. And like, so, and like this sort of arms race, it's like,
that does undermine the arms race. Like if you feel like it's going to cost you $10 billion to stay in the arms race, and you're like, wait a second, this dude just showed up with the same thing for $500 million.
Of course, there's that. But then there's also, and then it's like a week later, the Alibaba guy comes out with the thing that's almost as good, but then it takes up 5% of the memory footprint. It's like, you're almost a sucker if you, and especially because I think there's increasingly clarity that the value is going to be captured at the app layer. Not the winner of all this sort of arms race, if you will, are companies like Palantir and like companies that can price to value, and capture the sort of surplus of value that they're creating for solving business problems.
And they have the sticky interface. It's a lot easier to switch out a model than it is to leave Foundry.
And the consumer mind share, like, your average man on the street doesn't even know what Claude is, but they do know what ChatGPT is now. And ChatGPT has a ton of mind share, and that's worth something. And, but I think you're already starting to see this with Microsoft and like Amazon. It was like, okay, Microsoft's with OpenAI, Amazon's with Anthropic, right? And especially like, because they have this big deal now where Anthropic's going to be using 400,000 of their Trainium 2 chips for training. So by the way, like NVIDIA's not the only one that'll have a coherent thing, because like you're going to have 400,000 identical Trainium chips. Now, each one won't be as good as a B200, but like, again, it's like if you got 400,000 and the other guy's only got, 100,000 or 200,000, maybe it's like good enough, right? And then don't forget about Google has their TPUs, which they don't really tell you that much about anymore, because they don't sell them anymore. But like, don't TPUs, V6, they're now on the 6th version, right? Like, you don't think that constitutes a coherent pool of compute? I think it does, right? I mean, now they haven't been doing that much with it. If you look at the quality of the models compared to, where you would think they should be, given that they freaking invented transformers and have had TPUs for like, 10 years.
Well, if they would get the HR department out of the,
it's like the most
consumer-facing
squandering of a lead. I don't know how Sundar still has a job, but that's neither here nor there. Actually, for the first time, I now think they have a somewhat decent offering. Like, I made this open source project that makes like mind maps from any like source document. And I made it so it just works out of the box with like OpenAI, Deepseek, Anthropic, and then I added in the Google Gemini one. And like, the thing is, they just have priced it. They're so desperate for market share that they really priced it to move. So like Gemini 2.0 Flash Lite is like half the price of GPT-4o Mini, but it's like pretty good model. Like it can even handle bigger context window than the minis without getting confused. And I was like pleasantly surprised with the quality of the results of the mind maps it generated at a fraction of the cost. But I would never use it for like programming stuff, like, as a knowledge worker.
Yeah.
But if you have an API that, is able through clever engineering to kind of make simpler prompts that don't take that much context, then it's actually increasingly a good option. But yeah, I think so. As I was saying, it seemed for a while like it was like, yeah, Microsoft with OpenAI, Amazon with Anthropic, but now it's like suddenly like, wait, Amazon's also with Mistral, and it's like, oh, and Microsoft's also doing stuff with like, or like Microsoft's been sort of like they're both sleeping around, if you will, like they're no longer, the loyal
monogamists.
Monogamous partners that they were before. And I think there's this idea that like, well, who the hell wants to get tied down? Let's do the AI polycule or whatever. And that was always the case with the open source stuff. Like you always had the Llama models available on AWS Bedrock and Azure, right? And then, within a week of Deepseek models coming out, they were available on there, Like, so that's going to be a thing too, right? So I think there's going to be this sort of idea of like the model is not necessarily such a big differentiator, except for maybe, the most demanding applications, and you're not even necessarily going to get paid that much for it. Somebody else is going to be the one making the real money on that, because again, you go back to like the example of DRAM, it only takes 2 or 3 players for a market to get shot from like the standpoint of like, you only make the really sexy margins and returns on capital if you're like the only game, or if you're the best, where it's like, yeah, like you don't have to buy a Hermes bag. You could buy this one from like, Coach. It's not as good though. And it's like, and they know that. And so that's all it takes for Hermes to be able to charge, 20 times as much, right? Like Coach bag's probably pretty good, but it's not like that. So, and it's like, if you have the best model, if you have a very high value add application, like this company Harvey that does legal tech, where the user is some associate at Cravath, Swaine & Moore charging, $1,500 an hour for his services, if you can give him a slightly better recommendation or not bug him with like, oh, this thing's wrong when it's really right, that's worth it. They're willing to pay for that. But who's that surplus going to flow to? I would argue it's going to flow mostly to Harvey, and that they'll pay a little bit more, especially if it's the case with these reasoning models where it's like, even if your base model is not quite as smart, you could sort of make up for it by just cranking up the number of tokens. Like O1 Pro, I don't think the base model is as good as Claude 3.7 Sonnet. But if you give O1 Pro 10 minutes to come up with something, often it can still come up with something better, like, in terms of performance or reliability than 3.7 Sonnet. And so, if it's really just a cost thing, just throw more tokens at it, So, but again, we're talking about like people often just miss the forest for the trees. A lot of the demand for this stuff is not going to be that most high value use case where like, you'll pay anything to get a slightly more accurate answer. It's like a lot of these use cases are, man, these models have been good enough for like 18 months. And now like, the model quality from 18 months ago, that was the frontier, you can now get it for 25 cents for 1 million tokens. So it's like, forget it. Like, why would I, like, it's good enough. It's been good enough. And it's now so dirt cheap. It's like too cheap to meter. So it's sort of irrelevant for a lot of these use cases, I think.
So let's pivot here towards, more of the real world stuff with Tesla and So I guess the first question is, how much experience do you have with FSD, and what is your impression of full self-driving software?
I've actually never been in a Tesla that was using it, but I've been sort of like obsessed with the technology and watching videos of it since like, for years now. And like, I was watching like, the Tesla self-driving day and AI day back when, Andre Carpathy was still running the show there. And by the way, that was the coolest result of writing my article, is that Andre Carpathy followed me on Twitter, and he only follows like 950 something people, and we like DMs
he's
each
very
other.
selective.
And I was like, dude, that's so, because I've been like the biggest fan of this guy since he was in college, like literally like going back. I was like writing, comments on his YouTube videos for his like artificial life simulation that he made while I was still a college student, like script bots. And I was like, dude, you got to bring script bots back. Anyway, so I've been following it like sort of from afar. And what I saw is that as they sort of increasingly went to like a true end-to-end, where the whole thing is kind of differentiable end-to-end, there's no like hand
add inference.
Yeah. That was a sort of like, it turns into this rat's nest of like, if statements and, just conditional hell, where you start trying to like hardwire, because it's like every time you try to hardwire in one rule, it has edge cases with other ones, and it just never works. And the right way to do it is the way brains do it, which is like full differentiable end-to-end learning. And they moved over to that, and it's like everything started getting much, much better, like maybe 18 months ago.
Much faster. Yeah.
Well, just you have a really good way to measure this, which is like the number of disengagements per, million miles driven or whatever, 1,000 miles driven. And that's like plunged, and like to me, the most convincing thing is like seeing a guy drive from like San Francisco to San Jose or whatever. The whole thing is recorded. There's not a minute unaccounted for, and the guy never has to, put his hand on the steering wheel. That's freaking nuts. Even if you had to do that 10 times to get one time that worked, which I don't think is the case, I think it did just work, it would still be like mind-blowingly impressive. And so, yeah, I mean, we're going to move in a couple months from Brooklyn in an apartment to the burbs, and I'm like, want to get a Cybertruck myself, and I'm a little worried though. Someone's gonna write "fuck Elon" on it. It's like, because it's like, or it's gonna get like Molotov cocktail. So maybe not, but we'll see. But yeah, no, I think this is hugely transformative, because it's like, look, I have my license. I know how to drive. I hate driving. I think driving is like the single most dangerous thing that most people do in their whole life, and it's like the most likely to just have this catastrophic, tragic cutting short of their life. And especially for someone like me, like, I don't drive that much because, we have a car, but I don't use it that much because we're in the city. I don't need it. I'd rather take the subway or an Uber. Like, it's so much easier. I don't have to deal with parking. And so for someone like me, it's like, I hate like, changing lanes on the highway. Like the very thing that I find scariest is the thing like that self-driving's been able to kind of do in its sleep for like a while now. And so to me, it's like this hugely transformative thing from a safety perspective and convenience, and like my willingness to like take our, girls to like, ballet lessons or whatever is a lot higher if I know I can just sort of like have the car do it safely, and I can just be there as a last gap, just in case. So I think that's huge. But, look, the thing I'm really excited about is the robot, because the robot's just, I really do think this is like, people just underestimate the impact of this, that because it's like one of these things where, earlier I was talking about how all the pieces are there to have this like really capable agent for like customer service for like American Express. Like you don't have to say, suppose we had this technology, like it already exists. You just literally have to just put some pieces together. And that's why I'm sort of confused why it hasn't happened yet, because I feel like I could make something in a couple months that would work really well. So what the hell are they waiting for? But like, just by assembling stuff out of pieces that exist, right? All the technology's there. And I'd say in the case of the humanoid robots, like all the sort of hardest parts are sort of already there. Like, like for the eyes, the ears, the vestibular sense, these are sensors that have been perfected and then some in smartphones. They've been great for years and they're dirt cheap. And like, this, system on a chip, for doing sort of all the base kind of stuff of controlling things, like not even the neural network stuff. It's never been faster and cheaper and more power efficient. And so, and then it's like we have the LLMs now. They're multimodal. You have self-driving, which is essentially the same problem, except instead of rolling, you're walking. And then we've had humanoid robots from companies like Boston Dynamics for a while. The problem was always the control problem, which we were solving in this kind of very brittle, slow, silly way, where you look the behind the scenes of all their impressive videos is them hand tuning and coding and refining so that if in the first 5,000 times it tries to do the backflip, it falls on its ass. That's not what anybody cares about. What we want is a robot that just does it like, a child can by the age of, 3 or 4, which is they can just do stuff and you can push them and they can react and it just handles it. Maybe can't do a backflip, but it's not that the hard part is to get something that doesn't need to be programmed, that could just do things through imitation and then just through reinforcement learning in a sort of virtual gymnasium, explore, and that's really where all these things are, changing. That in the past, you'd have to do all this crazy math, Lie groups and stuff to do, inverse kinematics problem to know where your end effector is going to be at the end of a 6-axis arm. Now it's forget it, just feed in the angle data from the sensors and the torques and just have a recurrent neural network or, just, hooked up to some reinforcement learning thing and it'll just figure it all out the way brains do. And so all the pieces are there. And then the most important piece of all is the brain, the prefrontal cortex that can do planning, understanding language, make a plan and execute it and compare how it's going to how I wanted it to go. And we've got that now. That's the hardest single part. And we solved the IQ problem. We have these smart models that are smarter than probably most people now, certainly most college graduates, I'd say, in many cases. We just have to put them all together. And if we can do that, even let's say it's at the $50,000 price point. I mean, hell, make it a simpler thing. Say at the $90,000 price. Well, guess what costs $90,000? A Cybertruck. And you can lease that for $1,000 a month for that 90, I know, cause I'm looking at this, right? So $1,000 a month. Well, if I just look at how much we pay, to get a cleaning lady come to my apartment, it's I don't know, $300-400 a month. When we move to a house, it'll probably be even more. And then, okay, how much does it cost to get somebody to, cut the grass? That's another couple $100, right? And then, by the way, the cleaning person who comes, they don't even do that great a job. They just do the floor. They're not organizing anything. I mean, this Tesla robot,
they're only there a couple times during the whole month. Whereas,
right. The Tesla
someone
robot,
who's there every day.
The Tesla robot, while we're sleeping, could be with the toothbrush in the grout, polishing everything to a mirror shine and just doing everything, literally perfect, organize everything perfectly. They know what everything is. They know where things go. Oh, this is a charger for this device. Let me put it next to the device to make it easy for them. All the stuff. And they can just do everything for you. They could not just clean the floor, but clean your shoes and do your laundry and cook for you and just so many things that they could do. Once you've solved one of these problems, you have the dexterity and the intelligence to do basically all of them. And so if you can lease this thing for $1,000 a month, it's this is already, there's a ton of people. Now, not everybody has a spare $1,000 a month to spend, but okay, let's say it starts out that much. Within
a lot of businesses do.
Well, that's for damn sure. Because guess what? $1,000 a month is $12,000 a year. That's nothing. That's not, and the full, even if you just have
that's the worst of worker, crappy, part-time employees cost you.
Exactly. If you want a full-time worker, when you fully bake in for, workman's comp and the benefits and everything, you're already there, but you have to pay that every year instead of once, to buy this thing. And now you own it. And by the way, if you do it on a per hour worked, because they don't have to sleep, right? But then it's more than that. It's they never come in drunk or stoned. They never miss a day because they're sick. They never steal from you. There's a lot of benefits here where it's and then but also
it's at least an order of magnitude less sexual harassment cases at least.
Yeah, that's for sure. Right. And then, but then you think of all these other things, think of all the people who work at skilled nursing facilities and assisted living, communities, and that just like help the old people get out of bed and get up out of the chair and serve them their food and, rotate them in the bed so they don't get bed sores, help them to go to the bathroom. That stuff could all be done too. It's like massive swaths of the economy could very quickly be replaced, where there'd be this very powerful economic incentive to do that. Unless we, I think there's probably going to be some crazy robot taxes where if you want to replace, it's like how with like H-1B visas, like you have to kind of show that you tried to hire an American first before they let you do it. There'll probably be a thing like where to get a license to buy a new humanoid robot, you had to like try to hire a person and you couldn't find someone, there'll be some kind of thing like that, because otherwise it's just going to be just so disruptive. I just have to imagine the political, it's because right now people think of robots in a kind of fun way, where they joke about Terminator maybe, but it's like, everyone's like, oh, cool, robots, that'd be great. Something to do my laundry. And they're not like completing the thought of like, wait a second, that could do my job too, and it's like, what the hell do I need to get paid all this money for then? So, yeah, but people really are underestimating this. Like, I see people talk about this like it's 15, 20 years away. And I'm like, yeah, more like 20 months away, dude. Like, you have no idea what's coming. Like, yeah. So, and I think, look, and then you're like, well, who's going to be the winner of this? It's like, I mean, if you look at American companies, at least, it seems to me like there's only just a few possible guys like that are going to be doing it. Like, I think Tesla seems like they have everything they need to be able to dominate this. Like they're really good at electrical and mechanical engineering. They already have the self-driving stuff they can piggyback on. They've already been doing this now for 2 years? I
think longer than that now. Yeah.
And they're very well capitalized. They don't need to raise a bunch of startup money, right? I mean, and then you have Figure. I mean, maybe, but like they don't have all those advantages, I think. Boston Dynamics, it's like, okay, they've been at it for 30 years now. I'm not convinced they have what it takes. I think the real competition is going to be from the Chinese. Like Unitree is really doing well. But yeah, so I look, and you just think about like, I mean, even if you have a car, it's like, how much are you really using your car? Whereas like something that can do anything that a human can do, that's like much more transformative. That's worth much more money, like to the economy, if you can do that. I mean, I think you're going to see a world where before you necessarily buy the robot to cut your grass, there'll be like this new hybrid lawn care company that has a bunch of robots, humanoid robots, or just, kind of self-driving lawnmowers, and they'll just come over and it'll be one dude controlling the fleet of robots and charging like a half or a third of what a human crew would charge now. And that'll be the sort of first to happen, because someone will make that, see a real great opportunity to make a lot of money doing it. And so it'll happen kind of first. And they'll be like willing to be a beta tester and make, go through the growing pains.
Yep. So talk to me about how you see the technical challenges of getting something like FSD to work, and then just
in a humanoid robot.
To the humanoid robot that at least for full self-driving right now, we don't have something that's running that compute in a cloud. So it's got to run on a tiny little computer that fits inside of a car. It's not a rack of GPUs. It can only pull, I think right now the hardware 3 computers are somewhere below 500 watts, and then the hardware 4 ones are somewhere below 500 watts, and they're talking about the hardware 5 computers being able to pull up to 1,000 watts. But limited power, definitely limited footprint, and it's got to make all of these decisions to drive in real time.
Yeah, sure. So, well, obviously a car has a much bigger battery than, a humanoid robot can have, right? Because the whole thing is basically a giant battery, like in the chassis. But guess what?
But you're reducing your range. Yeah, the more power you use.
Cars can go 90 miles an hour. This thing's going to go like 5 miles an hour. So that just means like the number of like frames is, per second that you have to be able to like you could process like every like fifth frame and still be like,
Oh, yeah, you're talking about the robot. Yes.
yeah, that's why the robot's got a much. Also, the other thing is like if you fuck up in the car, you crash, everyone dies. If you fuck up in the robot, it like bumps into, your cabinet at a very slow rate of speed. It's not that big of a deal. And also like the thing is like they're just moving so slowly that just from like kind of proximity sensors, it's slow enough relative to the speed of their own actuators that the second there's a sort of mismatch between their perception and the world, but then they see that they're about to hit something, they can just pull back quickly like a human can. You can't do that in a car because you're just like, you can't just suddenly change your steering because now you're going to hit somebody else. You can't slam on the brakes because you're going to fly forward. So it's a much easier kind of space to like compensate for stuff when you're going much, much more slowly, where your rate of locomotion relative to the rate of speed of your actuators moving your limbs. So I don't think it'll be an issue at all. And I think like, it's just lower stakes, right? It's more about like obstacle avoidance and not like falling and like,
I think the real difficulty there is just the range of different tasks that you're going to do and having a form of intelligence that's generalized enough to do all the different things.
I don't think that'll be a problem at all because you literally like, they already have this incredibly rich world model just by virtue of like, even when these LLMs are trained without multimodal, where they can't natively understand images, they have a very rich world model, just like a blind person does, right? But when they're trained end-to-end multimodal with like vision, they think about images with tokens in a similar kind of way that they think about, sentences and right. Like, to them, it's like, they already know what all these objects are just from the training process. Not only that, they know what they're used for. Like, they know that, that chargers are used to charge electrical devices, and they can recognize that this is an iPhone charger and this is just a generic USB-C. They already know all this stuff. Like, you don't have to tell it that. And they already know like the sort of world model of chargers need to be plugged into an outlet and then the other end plugged into a device. You don't have to tell them any of this stuff. And it's like really, and they know what food is and cooking. And like, already like they know every recipe under the sun practically and how to do it and what a frying pan is and that you either need some kind of butter or oil or it's going to burn. You don't have to tell it any of this stuff. So to me, it's just a question of closing the feedback loop of combining this sort of perception visually with the ocular, motor feedback loop of like, and that's why there's so much emphasis at Tesla on the pressure sensitivity of the fingers and being able to like pick up an egg delicately, but then also crack it, like doing those big ranges of like big differences and sort of like the ratio of like the smallest, most gentle touch to like this, strongest one. That's been something that robots really struggled with. Like in the past, like these KUKA or FENUC arms, they could pick up and move a car, but they also could knock your freaking head off if you get close to them because they're just too powerful. They're always, running at like extreme torque.
100% all the time.
Yeah. Or close enough that it's like, you can't even be around them. They have to be caged off. And so, but it's like, that's the problem they have to solve is like getting, and to me, this is like largely a solved problem already based on the demos I've seen. They're basically already there. It's just like, okay, let's just refine it a little bit more. Let's make it a little bit more cost effective. That's the sort of touch and dexterity at the hands level. But in terms of the locomotion, like these recent demos from Unitree are unbelievable, where they show real robot that, by the way, the baseline version of this robot's like 20 grand. They get the fully programmable ones like 50 or 60. But the one that's sort of locked down that you can't program it yourself is like 20, which means like just the cost of the bill of goods of the actuators and stuff is probably like 15, And this thing is able to run without falling pretty fast. it's able to do running kicks, like roundhouse kicks. It's unbelievable what this thing can do already. So to me, it's like this has already been largely solved, and it's just like putting these pieces together and doing the sort of reliability and
it's a lot of hard engineering work, like not getting it to just work once, but it has to work well every time, and then we got to build it at scale and all that stuff. But
that's just to me, it's just a question of like when, not if. And the when, it's more like, does it happen in 2.5 years or 4 years? But it's like, as soon as you have line of sight that something's like 4 years away, like 4 years goes by in a flash, in the grander scheme of things. It's like, still sometimes it amazes me that we're in 2025. It's like, because it feels like, COVID wasn't even that long ago. Things move quickly. And so it's like, as soon as you have line of sight that, oh, maybe I can do that. Maybe you're like, let me start planning for it. Like it will be available, and it's like, then already behaviors and investment patterns start to change. Like if you were about to spend a ton of money to automate your factory using like kind of old school robotics that have to be programmed by hand, maybe you're like, let's hold off a little bit, because if we could just get these humanoid robots, then we don't need to like get a whole new set of systems every time we change the product line, and that we will have these things that'll have like resale value. We'll be able to like lease them out to, for other things. Like, so
let's put your investor stock market hat back on for a second, because the comment that you made was really interesting there, that, once you have line of sight, then investment trends might start to change. So what do you say by the end of this year? Elon has talked about wanting to have 1,000 robots at work inside of Tesla. Let's say it's 500, and they're able to do demos showing that it's like effectively replacing a human.
Not completely like just for show.
Yeah.
I mean, look, even if the first demo is sort of completely for show, and that it's like not like, it's like, okay, so what? We're a year away from
it. It could do an hour of useful work.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, I think once you see the proof of concept there, and by the way, like, there are a lot of jobs that are like not that hard, where you're just like warehouse, like how many people work in a warehouse? You're just like lifting boxes, driving a forklift, loading up a truck, unloading a truck, opening a box, closing a box, So stuff that's not that hard, or just pick and pack, where you're literally just taking things off, like a mobile cart that comes to you and putting it in a box, and some other computer systems telling you what size box to use and which products to put in there. It's like, these are pretty easy things to do. Like, you can get a person off the street, even if they're like totally drug addicted and like half falling asleep, and they could do a halfway decent job of this. It's not that hard. So, I feel like that's, I just think like people just have to see it. They have to see it for real, and then they'll suddenly get it. But right now it still seems like it's the Jetsons to people. I mean, I'd say the same about LLMs. Like I still talk to people who should know better, but they don't. And they still think of these LLMs as like gimmicks or something. They don't even understand why or when you'd use them. And I'm like, are you serious, dude? Like I can do the work of like 20 people now. Like, and I am, like, so it's like, it's real. And it's like, they just have to see it. And then they'll be like, oh, I get it. And it's like all the people who have difficulty hiring, you see people like who are just like cannot hire for their life, if their life depended on it, for very simple jobs, like in a warehouse, even, where it's like just really hard to find somebody who wants to work, who will be reliable. And so the bar is low,
and while the tasks that you're talking about are simple tasks, it is hard for a person to do those tasks for 8 hours in a row or 10 or 12 hours. I don't know, those are some of the hardest jobs to hire for. Is just,
they're hard to hire for because no one wants to do them.
Yeah.
Unless they're like, an illegal immigrant who is just desperate for any kind of work, or, they say they want them, but then it's like, I I'm not going to come in today because I don't feel like it.
Yeah.
Like they just don't want to do it. Like it's just people have low effort, low diligence, or they have substance abuse problems, or whatever. Like it's just, if somebody had their act together, they probably wouldn't want to be doing that job in the first place. So it's hard to hire for that.
Man, I think that might be a good place for us to wrap up. I know we've been at it now for over 2 hours, so I want to be
it's been a lot
respectful of your time. Sorry, we ran a little bit long. So
should we call it a day then, or you want to?
Yeah, we can. Unless there's anything you want to double click on right here. Plug your YouTube script optimizer.
Oh, yeah. I kind of already did at the beginning, but yeah, look, I made this thing. It's like, I think it's really much better than the competitors, because I give you a really good transcript, like direct transcript, if that's what you want. But then I also give you this kind of separate thing. And so, and it's much sort of more polished, and you can edit it if you want, and it'll and it can even do things like generate like a multiple choice quiz that you could actually take and get graded on and share it with other people. Or short answer quiz. It's got all this functionality. And then actually I made a sort of sister site to it called fixmydocuments.com, which instead of you giving it just a YouTube video, you can give it any kind of document, a PDF, a Word file, or really kind of anything, like an image, text file, whatever. And it'll first extract the text in a really kind of smart way, where especially if it's a scanned document, it does a really good job of kind of correcting any transcription errors using LLMs. And then once you've gotten that sort of and it'll put it in this really nicely formatted version, similar to the YouTube transcript optimizer, where everything has this kind of nice headings and subheadings and stuff is in tables and it looks really nice. But then once you've gotten that, it lets you do all these other kind of derived documents from that. So you could turn that into like presentation slides as either like a PDF where it's like LaTeX formatted, really beautiful, optimized for that, for presentations, or HTML that you could share, or it could turn it into like, the quizzes that I mentioned before, or like a lesson plan, or, a really good, a mind map, or a synopsis, executive summary. Or it could even turn into like, these flashcards with like a built-in kind of Anki system, and you can share them with people. It's really this wonderful tool. So that's called fixmydocuments.com and YouTubeTranscriptOptimizer.com. So yeah, give them a try. I work really hard on them, and I think they're pretty good at what they do. And yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. Like, there's such an incredible wealth of information, and a lot to really chew on as far as the implications of how, like you said, we're in this hockey stick moment for artificial intelligence, and the Cambrian explosion of possibilities is huge. And there's kind of been this consensus around what that was going to look like for a few specific companies. And so it's good to lean into how big the moment is for AI and maybe reset to reality on, NVIDIA specifically, or some of the other things. So I really appreciate just thinking through all these things more deeply with us. And, hopefully the audience got a little bit smarter today.
Yes. Great. All right. Thank you.
Bye.